He spoke the ancient name aloud. On the eighth night, it was living inside his voice. Welcome back to Karma Quietly Whispers, my loves. This is your place for spooky, creepy, and scary stories. My name is Alara, and I am your whisperer. Tonight, please join me as we journey together. I'm sure you will enjoy what is to come. So, let us begin. Language is the oldest technology we have. Older than metal, older than fire in its controlled forms. The capacity to take a thing that exists only in the mind and force it into the world through a sound. Every word you have ever spoken was, in its earliest form, a kind of invocation. The calling of a concept out of thought and into shared reality. Dead languages carry the residue of this. Words that haven't been spoken in 3,000 years still contain the full acoustic weight of every context in which they were used. Prayer, command, curse, name. When a linguist reads them, they do so carefully, because the discipline has learned, in aggregate, that some words do not stay academic. Dr. Martin Vael found the tablet in a collection. He had no academic reason to be examining and spent 6 months on a name he had no professional reason to pursue. He was thorough. He was gifted. He was, by the metrics of his field, exactly the kind of person you'd trust with something old and dangerous. He spoke the name aloud in a quiet room on a Tuesday evening, because he was a scientist and he wanted to hear how the phonemes fit together. 7 nights later, he understood what the tablet had been waiting for. The tablet had arrived at the University of Edinburgh's Near Eastern Studies collection inside a shipping crate from a private estate in Vienna, part of a larger acquisition of miscellaneous Mesopotamian materials that the department had accepted without cataloging resources, which meant it sat in a labeled archive box for 14 months before Dr. Martin Vael, 52, comparative linguist and specialist in pre-Akkadian script systems, pulled it out on a Thursday afternoon while looking for something else. It was limestone, approximately 30 centimeters square, the surface densely inscribed in a cuneiform script that Vael identified within minutes as proto-Sumerian, 4th millennium BCE, possibly earlier, the specific variant associated with the Uruk period's administrative and sacred record-keeping traditions. The inscription covered both faces of the tablet and wrapped around the edges, which was unusual. Most Uruk period tablets of this size used only the front face. The use of the edge suggested either a scribal error or a specific intention to complete a circuit, to make the inscription continuous, unbroken. He photographed it and spent the afternoon with the images. The inscription was a single personal name, repeated. Not in the Sumerian convention of repetition for emphasis, not as a litany of epithets. The name itself varied at the phoneme level in each iteration, as though each repetition were a slightly different acoustic rendering of the same underlying sound. He identified over the following weeks 412 distinct variations across the tablet's surface. Each one was a recognizable approximation of a root sequence he transcribed, after considerable analysis, as a Kurgalannazuen. The name was not in any reference he could locate. He searched the complete cataloged archive of proto-Sumerian personal names, gods, kings, priests, private individuals, and found nothing matching the root. He searched comparative Elamite records, early Akkadian loanword lists, the Ebla archives. Nothing. He was, by temperament, not the sort of man who found the absence of reference alarming. He found it interesting. He worked on the phonetic reconstruction for 6 months, building a plausible acoustic rendering from the cuneiform evidence and comparative phonological data, refining it through several iterations. His reconstruction settled by late autumn into a sequence he was reasonably confident represented the original spoken form. A 7-syllable sequence with a particular quality he noted in his research journal as unusually complete. The phonemic structure creates a closed loop at the acoustic level. The final syllable contains the same resonance properties as the first, which is extremely rare in any language tradition, and which I cannot account for by conventional etymology. He spoke it on a Tuesday evening in his office at 8:47 p.m., with the building nearly empty, because he wanted to hear how the reconstruction sounded in still air. He was alone. He spoke it clearly at a measured pace, attending to each syllable with the precision of a man who has spent 30 years training his ear to the acoustic properties of ancient phonemes. The sound it made in the room was not quite the sound he expected. The vowels had a quality of depth, not loudness, not resonance in the conventional acoustic sense, but depth, as though the word were generating additional dimension in the space it occupied. He noted this in his journal and attributed it to the unusual closed loop, phonemic structure he had already identified. Then he heard the echo. His office had carpet, bookshelves on every wall, the acoustic profile of a room that does not echo. He knew this because he had used it, deliberately, for listening to reconstructed ancient speech for 20 years. A dead room, acoustically speaking, which was exactly what he needed for careful phonemic analysis. The echo should not have been possible. It came from the window. The window was dark, November, 8:47 p.m., and returned a faint but unmistakable repetition of the name's final 3 syllables. He turned to face the window. He'd been sitting with his back to it. The reflection in the dark glass was his own, and it was, by every normal measure, simply his reflection. Same posture, same expression, same scholarly disorder of papers and teacups on the desk behind him. Its mouth was moving, not in synchrony with him. He had stopped speaking. Its mouth was forming, with a specific careful enunciation of someone trying to produce unfamiliar phonemes accurately, the sequence he had just spoken. He turned back to his desk and sat with this for a moment. He picked up his journal and wrote, "Possible auditory artifact. Check acoustic properties of window glass. Note, subjective visual impression of reflection discrepancy. Stress, low blood sugar, low light conditions." He went home. He told himself it was nothing. He went to sleep. The second echo came from his bathroom mirror at 6:20 a.m. The shower was running. He heard the name through the water. Very faint. The specific frequency of a voice trying to be heard through interference. He turned off the shower and stood in the steam and the silence and heard, from the misted mirror surface, a single syllable of the sequence, the 4th one, the one he had noted as carrying the highest resonant density. He dressed and went to work without looking at the mirror again. By day 4, he had developed a thorough, meticulous log of every surface from which the echo had been received. Window glass, 23 instances. Mirrors, 17 instances. The still surface of his coffee in a ceramic mug, 3 instances, barely audible. The dark screen of his laptop in sleep mode, 6 instances. A puddle outside the building entrance on a still morning, 1 instance, which had been the most disturbing because the outdoor context had removed every possible acoustic explanation. And because the water's surface had showed a face looking up at him from the puddle that he had decided, with the same methodical honesty he applied to everything, was not his own. The name was always the same sequence, never varied, not the 412 variations of the tablet, but the single reconstruction he had spoken on Tuesday evening, his phonemic composite, his voice's rendering. On night 7, he sat in his office with all the lights on and faced the window deliberately. He had been avoiding reflective surfaces. He faced it now because he was a scientist, and because 7 nights of documentation had produced a data set he needed to examine directly rather than peripherally. The reflection formed the name in silence for 14 minutes, then stopped. He sat at his desk after it stopped and felt, in the quality of the silence that followed, that something had changed, not in the room, in him. A quality he did not have language for that evening, and that he spent the following weeks trying to describe in his journal with mounting precision. A second layer in his voice, not audible to himself, audible, as he discovered, to others. His graduate student, Priya, mentioned it first, on the 9th day, with the tentative precision of someone raising something they can't quite justify raising. She had been transcribing his dictated notes, and she asked, very carefully, whether he had been chanting something while he worked, because there was a sound in the recording underneath his voice that she couldn't isolate or identify. She played him the clip. He listened. Beneath his own voice, beneath his words, beneath the specific prosodic pattern of his dictation, ran a continuous, faint, unmistakable sound. The name, every syllable present in correct sequence, cycling without pause, carried on his voice the way a carrier wave carries a signal. He was not producing it consciously. He could not stop it by concentrating, or by altering his speech pattern, or by going silent. When he went silent, the name continued. Unvoiced but present in the air of whatever room he was in, received by reflective surfaces, and returned to him, as he had received it for 7 nights. The tablet was in the archive room. He went back to it with fresh eyes and the specific, now physical understanding of what it contained. The inscription was not a record of the name. It was not a list, or a litany, or an administrative notation. The 412 variations of the root sequence on the tablet's surface were not repetitions. They were a progressive phonemic unlocking sequence, each variation narrowing the acoustic field toward the single correct reconstruction that would, when spoken aloud in a sufficiently still and reflective environment, open the resonant channel between the name's current dormancy and a living human vocal apparatus. The tablet had been waiting 4,000 years for a phonologist skilled enough to reconstruct the sequence accurately, for a linguist precise enough to speak it cleanly on the first attempt, for a quiet office with a dark window, The name that lived in Martin Vael's voice now was not his. It had never been in a human throat before him, had existed between the moment of the deity's withdrawal from active reality in the third millennium, BCE, and Tuesday evening in November, in the limestone of the tablet, in the acoustic potential of its inscription, patient and dormant and entirely prepared. It had not forgotten itself. It had simply been waiting for a voice good enough to carry it. In the weeks after the 9th day, Priya began humming the sequence at her desk without noticing she was doing it. His colleague, Dr. Ferris, who had listened to 3 minutes of his dictation recording as a courtesy, began using a phrase in conversation that Vael recognized with a quality of cold precision as a second syllable of the root. 2 of his students handed in papers with the root sequence's phonemic pattern reproduced in their written analysis of unrelated texts, not the name itself, which neither of them would have had context to recognize, but the underlying acoustic structure surfacing in their writing the way a melody surfaces in humming. The god whose name lived in his voice was not awake, not yet, but it was speaking itself through him and through everyone his voice touched, building the acoustic presence it needed. Small increments, 1 syllable at a time, in the unconscious productions of everyone in proximity to the man who had, with the thoroughness and precision of 30 years of scholarship, given it the perfect instrument. Martin Vael continued his work. He had no choice. He could not stop speaking, and his voice continued to carry the name regardless of what he said. His journal entries grew increasingly technical and increasingly silent at their margins, in the white space around his careful notation, where the pen had pressed and lifted without making marks. He knew what the tablet had been. He knew what he had done. He did not know yet what the name intended to say once it was loud enough to say it. He suspected he would find out. He was, by every professional metric, exactly the right person to find that tablet. 30 years of training in precisely the acoustic and linguistic tools required to reconstruct the sequence accurately. A quiet office. A careful, methodical approach to dead languages that had never, in 3 decades, given him any reason to treat a phonemic reconstruction as anything other than scholarship. The tablet had been waiting for exactly this profile. Not for a credulous mystic who might have spoken the name in the wrong register, or a cautious archivist who might never have spoken it at all. It needed a phonologist, precise, curious, and sufficiently confident in the empirical framework of their discipline to speak an ancient word aloud in a quiet room without flinching. He provided that. He did it perfectly. What I keep returning to is the 412 variations. That is not the work of a scribe who was repeating a name for ritual emphasis or devotional practice. That is an engineering document, a progressive narrowing sequence designed to survive 4,000 years of potential, partial damage, and still function. Whoever inscribed that tablet understood that the name needed to be recoverable, and built redundancy into the recovery mechanism with the care of someone designing critical infrastructure. They built it to be found by someone like Martin. The god is not awake. Not yet. It is speaking itself into increasing presence through a linguist who lectures 3 times a week and dictates notes to a graduate student who has started humming at her desk. The name is spreading. I wonder how quiet your room is tonight. Thank you for joining me tonight. My name is Alara, and I am your whisperer. I'll be here, waiting for you next time. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your stories. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more. This has been Karma Quietly Whispers. See you soon.